Eleanor Ashby kept walking. The path back to Wyndham Hall stretched through the copper-leafed oaks. She followed it with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who has decided that stopping is not an option. The air smelled of cold earth and dying leaves. Her hands, clasped at her waist, were perfectly still. 3 years. 3 years she had believed him. The clearing was behind her now, and Victor Hale was already gone. She had not watched him go. She had simply turned and walked, because that was the only thing left to do. The words he had said were still hanging in the cold air somewhere behind her, but Eleanor refused to let them catch up. She was 20 years old, 6 weeks pregnant, and entirely alone. Her father had been dead 2 years. There was no dowry. There was no plan. There had been a plan. 3 years of a plan built in secret, built on promises Victor had made in whispers when no one else was listening. He had called her his greatest secret. He had called her the one woman who understood him. He had told her, again and again, that when the time was right, when his family's expectations were managed, when he had secured his position, then he would come to her openly. She had believed him. She had been 20 years old, and she had believed every word of it. And then this afternoon she had told him about the child. And Victor Hale, Lord Hale, smooth and immovable, had told her exactly what she was worth. If she named him, he said, he would call her a whore to the entire village. He would walk away clean, his word against hers, the gentleman, or the girl from the cottage. She would be ruined in an afternoon. Everyone she loved would be touched by it. Her sister Sophia, whose husband Edmund was cousin to the Duke of Wyndham, whose family dinner was in progress at this very moment inside the hall whose lights Eleanor could see through the trees. He had not raised his voice. He had spoken in that careful, intimate tone he used when he was most serious. And then he had gone. Desperation was pressing against her chest. But Eleanor Ashby had her father's nature, and her father had been a man who kept meticulous accounts. And the first rule of meticulous accounts was this: you do not fall apart in the middle of an open field. You take stock, you find the next column, you move. She moved. The hall rose ahead of her through the trees. Wyndham Hall was not a house you approached casually. It sat in its grounds the way a crown sits on a table, as if it had never needed to announce itself, as if announcing itself would be beneath it. The stone was pale in the fading light, the windows blazing with the warmth of the birthday dinner in progress, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the drive and felt the full weight of what she was carrying. Sophia did not know. No one knew. And for a little while longer, Eleanor could still choose what happened next. The cage, when she laid it out precisely in her mind, had 3 walls. The first wall, no money. Her father's tailoring business had left debts, not savings. She lived in the cottage by the grace of Sophia's kindness. She had no income, no property, nothing in her name. The second wall, Victor's threat. The moment she named him, he would destroy her story before she could tell it. He was a lord. She was a country girl in a handed-down gown. She already knew how that argument ended. The third wall, proximity. Sophia's husband was Edmund Wyndham, cousin to the Duke himself. If Eleanor's shame became public, it would not stay in the village. It would reach Edmund's door. From Edmund's door, it would reach the Duke's. The scandal would swallow everyone she loved before it swallowed her. 3 walls, no roof, not yet, which meant there was still something like sky above her. Eleanor was a woman who found what was not yet lost. She walked toward the hall. The dinner was visible through the tall windows of the ground floor, the soft shapes of Sophia and Edmund, and the other guests moving behind the glass. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the building rather than entering directly. She needed a moment longer, just a moment, to arrange her face, to put everything she was feeling into the column where it belonged so she could function. As she walked the long south wall, her eyes moved across the windows as they passed, counting them the way she always counted things, and she stopped. One window was lit differently from the rest, not the warm gold of the dining room, not the gathered brightness of the drawing room. This was a quieter light, a reading lamp set close to the glass. The library. Eleanor did not know who would be sitting alone in the Wyndham Hall library while the birthday dinner filled every other room with noise and candlelight. She had not thought to ask. She had been too consumed with her own walls to notice the light. But later, when she tried to remember when her life had turned, she would come back to this moment. The walking, the cold, the single-lit window in the library, set apart from all the rest. She had no idea that the man sitting alone behind that glass would become the only door her impossible situation had left. Eleanor had arranged her face before she walked through the door. She was accomplished at this. 3 years of Victor Hale had given her a talent for composure she had never asked for and would never have chosen. She could sit at a dinner table with her hands folded and her expression perfectly pleasant, while her interior was conducting a completely separate conversation. She had gotten very good at it. Sophia's birthday dinner was bright with candles, and the particular noise that happens when a dozen people gather in a room that is too fine for most of them, and everyone is working slightly too hard at appearing comfortable. Eleanor found her sister across the room immediately. Sophia was laughing at something Edmund had said, her dark eyes bright, the happiness on her face entirely genuine. Eleanor was glad of it. Sophia's happiness had always felt like something worth protecting. She had not yet told Sophia. She would not tell her tonight. Tonight she would simply survive the dinner, smile at the right moments, and then she would go home and think. She was very good at thinking. Her father had made her good at it. Richard Ashby had been a country tailor in the village of Haverwick, a small man with large hands and the most precise mind Eleanor had ever encountered. He had kept accounts the way other men kept faith, with rigour and daily attention, and the calm conviction that the numbers, if you were honest with them, would always tell you the truth. He had taught Eleanor his system when she was 12 years old. She could balance a column in her head before she could write a full sentence in copperplate. She had loved it. She had loved the order of it, the certainty. A figure that did not balance announced itself immediately. No ambiguity, no room for the comfortable lie. He had died when Eleanor was 17, leaving debts and a cottage, and a grief so large she could only carry it by keeping it very small and very still. Victor had appeared 6 months after the funeral. She had known even then that she should be careful. She was not a fool, but she had been 17 and grieving and very alone, and Victor Hale was patient and charming, and he had more time than anyone she had ever met. He had pursued her in absolute secrecy for 3 years, not because he was ashamed of her, he said, but because his family's expectations were complicated, and he did not want her subjected to the scrutiny that would come too soon if they moved publicly. He said it so reasonably. He said it every time she worried, and every time she believed him, and every time she felt slightly ashamed of herself for worrying. She had been so very stupid. The word settled in her chest, and she made herself acknowledge it squarely, the way her father had taught her to acknowledge an error in the accounts. Clearly, completely, without drama, because dramatic responses to errors only made the correction harder. She had been stupid. She had trusted the wrong man for 3 years. The child now 6 weeks formed beneath her ribs was the proof of it. She could not unknow it. She could only move forward. The cage, when she laid it out now in the candlelit warmth of the birthday dinner, had 3 walls as precise as ledger columns. The first wall was money. Her father's tailoring business had left debts that Sophia's marriage to Edmund Wyndham had absorbed, quietly and without being asked, in the way that Sophia absorbed problems. Eleanor lived in the cottage at the edge of the estate. She had no income of her own, no property, nothing in her name that a child could be secured against. A child without a name, in a cottage, with a mother who could not work. The arithmetic of it was brutal, and she did not look away from it. The second wall was Victor's threat. He had not been unkind when he said it. That was what made it so effective. He had simply laid out the reality in the same tone he used for everything, calm, certain, undeniable. If she named him, he would deny it. His word against hers, the lord or the tailor's daughter. He had more money, more connections, more credibility. He had spent 3 years building a picture of himself as a respectable man, and she had no counter-evidence beyond her own word and a child that shared his chin. He would call her a whore before the village and walk away clean. She believed him. The third wall was Sophia. Edmund Wyndham was cousin to the Duke of Wyndham, and Wyndham Hall stood 2 miles from the cottage where Eleanor slept. If Eleanor's shame became public, and Victor would make it public, precisely and without hesitation the moment she moved against him, it would not stay in the village. It would reach Edmund. It would reach the estate. It would reach the Wyndham name, and the Wyndham name was the ceiling above everything Sophia had built. Eleanor could destroy herself. She would not destroy Sophia. 3 walls. She sat at the birthday dinner and watched the candles and thought about columns. She heard about the Duke of Wyndham before she saw him. Edmund mentioned him in passing. His cousin had returned from London for Sophia's birthday, had been meant to join the dinner but had declined the table in favour of the library, which was apparently not unusual behaviour for the Duke of Wyndham. Edmund delivered this without apology, because Edmund had known his cousin since childhood and had long since ceased to be surprised by him. Sophia delivered a look across the table at Eleanor that said, very plainly, "Men." Then Dorothea Wyndham arrived late to the dinner, and Eleanor stopped thinking about the Duke entirely. James Wyndham's mother entered a room the way cold air entered a room, not aggressively, not with drama, but with an immediate and total effect on the temperature. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed in the formal black she had apparently worn since her elder son Henry's death 3 years ago, with silver hair drawn back severely and eyes that were the colour of a winter sky at midday. She moved to her seat with the assurance of a woman who had never, in her life, considered whether she was welcome somewhere. She looked at Eleanor once, briefly, and then looked away. The look lasted long enough to take a full inventory and render a judgment. Eleanor felt it hit her square in the chest. The cut came 2 courses later. Dorothea had been discussing the county's marriage prospects. It was the kind of conversation she apparently conducted as a matter of routine, the way other people discuss the weather, and she had reached Eleanor's name in the natural course of the topic. "Miss Ashby is very fortunate to be included among us," Dorothea said. She said it pleasantly. She said it to no one in particular, which meant she said it to everyone. Her family's circumstances, after all. The connection to Sophia is not a small thing for a girl in her position. Very fortunate indeed. The table did not move. Eleanor's fork continued its correct journey from the plate to her mouth. She did not look up. She did not allow the flush she felt rising to reach her face. Humiliation flooded through her, hot, immediate, and deeply familiar, because Dorothea was not the first person who had ever spoken about Eleanor's family as a kind of unfortunate fact, and she would not be the last. But the heat of it was still real. The cut was real. The deliberate, gracious, entirely deniable cruelty of it was real. Sophia said, very clearly, "Eleanor is my sister, Dorothea, and has always been welcome in this house as my sister." Dorothea did not look at Eleanor when she delivered the reply, which was, Eleanor had learned, worse than if she had. "Of course," Dorothea said, and smiled, and returned to her dinner. Eleanor picked up her fork and kept her face perfectly still. She slipped away from the dinner during the remove. She did not plan it. Her body simply decided, between one breath and the next, that it could not sustain the performance for another course, that what she needed right now was 30 seconds of silence and a room with no one watching her face. She murmured something to Sophia about needing a moment, and Sophia, who always understood without being told, pressed her hand and let her go. The hallway outside the dining room was cool and quiet, the sounds of the dinner muffled behind her as she moved deeper into the house. She had been to Wyndham Hall enough times to know its layout in the way you know a house you have visited since childhood. Not precisely, not formally, but by instinct. The library was at the end of the corridor, and she was walking toward it before she had consciously decided to go. The room was smaller than she expected from the outside. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old leather and cold ash from a fireplace that had not been lit recently. A reading lamp burned on the desk near the window, the same lamp she had seen from the drive, the light that was separate from the rest. She had not noticed, when she walked toward it from the drive, that the desk was occupied, but the desk was empty now. Whoever had been sitting here had recently gone. The lamp was still burning, and there was an open book turned face down on the leather surface, and beside the book, spread open and weighted at the corners, was the estate ledger. Eleanor crossed to the desk and looked down at it, because she could not help it. It was the nature she had been given. The columns were meticulous at first glance. Her eye moved across the figures, trade accounts, quarterly settlements, the steady rhythm of an estate's income properly recorded, and then, 4 columns from the left, a discrepancy, not a large one, not the kind that would announce itself to someone not trained to look for it. But her father had trained her to look for exactly this, a figure that balanced on the surface but did not balance when you traced it back to its source. The credit was listed. The corresponding debit had been moved, recategorized, assigned to a line that should not have absorbed this particular charge. Eleanor stared at it. Her finger moved to the page and stopped just short of touching it. Someone had changed this entry. Not incorrectly, not through error. The handwriting was different from the surrounding entries, confident, deliberate, and slightly too neat. Someone had gone back to this column and corrected it after the fact. She straightened. She did not know whose ledger this was or what the account line meant. She did not know enough of the estate's accounts to say with certainty what the error signified. But she knew, with the absolute clarity her father had given her, that it was not an accident. The library door opened. Eleanor turned. The man in the doorway was tall enough that the frame accommodated him with the particular economy of someone who had learned to move through spaces slightly too small for him. Dark hair, dishevelled in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it. Grey-green eyes that found her immediately, and stayed there with an expression she could not immediately read. He was not what she had expected the Duke of Wyndham to look like. She had expected someone more polished, more like what a duke was supposed to be. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger she had just been studying. He looked at her again. "The library," he said, "is not part of the tour." He did not say it unkindly, but he said it as if he meant it, and the cold was in his voice before he even finished the sentence. Eleanor held his gaze. She had survived Dorothea's cut 20 minutes ago. She could survive this. "I was not touring," she said. "I was sitting, or I was about to. I am sorry. I did not realize anyone was using the room." He said nothing for a moment. He came into the library without asking permission to enter it, as if the idea that he required permission had genuinely not occurred to him, and he crossed to the desk and looked down at the open ledger with an expression that was difficult to interpret. 3 walls, every exit closed, and the Duke of Wyndham was standing between Eleanor and the door, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. She had no idea at all. He offered her his handkerchief. He did not ask if she was crying. He did not look at her face to confirm it. He simply crossed to the desk and set the folded square of linen on the surface near her hand, and then he moved away to the window and looked out at the dark grounds as if he had simply come into the room to admire the view. Eleanor stared at the handkerchief. She had been holding herself together with both hands for the past 6 hours. The small, practical kindness of a piece of linen undid something in her chest that she could not immediately recover. She picked it up. She pressed it briefly to her eyes. She did not cry, not properly, not with the full weight of the evening behind it, but she allowed herself to stop performing composure for exactly 4 seconds, and then she put the handkerchief back on the desk and straightened. "Thank you," she said. James Wyndham turned from the window. He had eyes that did not waver. She had noticed that immediately. "What has happened?" he said. It was not a gentle question. It was a practical one, the same tone he might use to ask why the estate accounts were not reconciled. But he had offered his handkerchief first, and that mattered. Eleanor looked at the window. She looked at the ledger still open on the desk. She looked at the handkerchief in her hand. And then she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do tonight, because there was no one else in the room, and she had been carrying it alone since the afternoon, and every exit was closed. "I am pregnant," she said. "The father has abandoned me, and will call me a whore before the village if I name him. I have no money. I have no options. I was sitting in your library because I needed 30 seconds when no one was watching my face." She said it without drama. She said it the way her father had taught her to state an error in the accounts, clearly, completely without embellishment, because embellishment only made the correction harder. James Wyndham looked at her for a long moment with an expression she still could not read. "How far along?" he said. He asked questions. He asked them in the same precise, uninflected tone he might use to question a steward about a quarterly settlement. How many weeks? Was there any documentation, letters, witnesses, anything that could be presented if he named himself? Was her family aware of the situation? Had she spoken to the man's family? Eleanor answered everything. She had not, until this moment, realized how much it cost to carry information in silence. Answering was almost a relief. James received each answer the way a man receives estate figures, noting them, filing them, proceeding to the next column without visible reaction. He did not express sympathy. He did not express judgment. His face was the face of a man who was thinking about a problem, and the problem happened to be Eleanor's entire life. It should have felt clinical. It did feel clinical, and yet he had given her his handkerchief before he asked anything at all. "Your situation requires resolution in a very short period," he said, when she had told him everything. "And resolution, at this point, means a name for the child and a position from which you cannot be socially destroyed. Those are the two facts." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I can provide both." She looked at him fully for the first time. He was standing near the fireplace, cold because the fire had not been lit for days, and his expression had not changed from the expression he had worn when he walked in and found her at the desk. It was controlled, completely controlled. The face of a man who kept everything locked away and let no one near it. "You are offering to marry me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He said, "Because my conscience will not allow what is being done to you and this child to continue. The man whose duty it is to act has refused to act. His conscience will apparently allow it. Mine will not." It was a formal statement. It was almost cold in its precision. Eleanor studied his face for the thing that was not being said, because there always was something not being said, and what she found was nothing she could name, just the mask, and behind it a density she could not see into. "And what do you receive from this arrangement?" she said. James was quiet for a moment. "An end," he said, "to certain questions about my continued bachelorhood that my mother has been pressing upon me since my brother's death." He said it flatly, as if this were also a ledger entry. "That is a separate matter. The relevant fact is that I am in a position to offer what you need, and the child is innocent of what its father chose. The power was entirely his, and both of them knew it. Eleanor had nothing to offer in return. She had no dowry, no connections, no social currency. She had a sharp mind and a handful of letters from a man who would deny writing them, and a child that would be called illegitimate from the first breath if Eleanor remained unmarried. Against this, James Wyndham held a name, a title, a fortune, and enough standing to face down Victor Hale's word, with something rather more persuasive than her own. She accepted the proposal. She accepted it plainly, without performance, because she was not a woman who dressed necessity up in gratitude she did not feel. "I accept," she said. "And I should tell you, I have nothing to give you in return for this. No money, no family connections, nothing that will be useful to your household or your position. I am aware that this is an extremely one-sided arrangement." James looked at her with something that was neither warmth nor its absence, something she could not place. "I would not say nothing," he said. She waited. "You have good sense," he said. "That is not nothing, and the child will not be punished for the sins of its father." He said it simply. He said it without heat, without performance, without any of the signs Eleanor associated with a man who was trying to be kind. He said it the way he said everything, as a fact, from behind the mask, with no indication that it had cost him anything. But Eleanor looked at him directly when he said it, and he did not look away. For one beat, just one, there was something in his grey-green eyes that was not the mask, something she recognized. It looked like a man who had decided that this particular thing mattered, even if he had not decided why. Then his expression settled back into its controlled stillness, and the moment closed. "I will arrange a special license," he said. "The ceremony will be private. You will be moved to Wyndham Hall within the week." The announcement did not go as Eleanor had expected, because she had not known what to expect. James delivered it with the same controlled calm he had used to propose, direct, brief, entirely without sentiment. He had spoken to Edmund first, privately. Edmund had apparently agreed to manage Sophia's reaction, because Sophia's face, when James stated the news at the assembled dinner table, showed not the alarm Eleanor had feared, but something complicated and watchful. Dorothea's face showed nothing at all, which was worse. "James," Dorothea said, when the announcement was complete. Her voice was a careful instrument. "This is rather sudden." "It is," James said. He did not elaborate. "Miss Ashby's family," Dorothea began. "Eleanor's family," James said, in exactly the tone Eleanor would have wanted, and could not have deployed herself, "is Sophia's family, which makes it, in the relevant ways, my family as well. I'm content with the arrangement." He said it without warmth. He said it as a fact. The fact was impassable. Everyone at the table could feel it. Dorothea looked at Eleanor with cold eyes and said nothing further. Sophia came to Eleanor's room later that night. "Tell me the truth," Sophia said, sitting on the edge of Eleanor's bed with her hands in her lap, her birthday flowers still pinned in her hair. Eleanor looked at her sister's face. The love in it was so obvious, so entirely without condition, that it was almost painful to look at directly. "I'm going to be all right," Eleanor said. "That is not the truth." "It is the beginning of it." Sophia pressed Eleanor's hand and did not push further. She understood that there were things Eleanor was not ready to say, and that pressing would only make her retreat. She stayed for an hour. She held Eleanor's hand. She left when Eleanor's eyes grew heavy. It was the most Sophia could offer. It was everything. The wedding was everything it needed to be, and nothing more. Private, quick, witnessed only by the vicar, Mr. Hollis, and Agnes, who had been with Eleanor since childhood, and whose face throughout the brief ceremony was perfectly composed and entirely illegible. The ring went on Eleanor's finger, plain gold, Wyndham family, worn smooth by generations, and James said the words with the gravity of a man who meant them in the technical sense. Eleanor said them back. In the rose suite afterward, James helped her with the 12 buttons on her bodice. He stood behind her and unfastened each one with a precision that was almost mechanical, not cold, but deliberate, as if he had set himself a task and was completing it correctly. Eleanor stood very still. The buttons were small pearl buttons set at the back, and she had not thought, until this moment, that she would need someone's hands to reach them. Her fingers had not been able to manage the angle. He unfastened the last button and stepped back. He did not linger. He did not make anything of it. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. He crossed to the settee against the far wall where a pillow and a folded blanket had been placed. She had not done this. Agnes must have arranged it, or Mrs. Holt, who had appeared at the door of the Rose Suite 3 hours earlier with an expression of absolute maternal authority, and told James, with the directness of a woman who had once changed his linens and had therefore earned certain rights, that she would not be having any nonsense in the management of the new Duchess's comfort. James had received this instruction in silence, and with the look of a man who had learned, sometime in childhood, that Mrs. Holt was not a force that could be argued with. Eleanor changed behind the dressing screen and lay down in the bed. She lay still in the dark and listened to the quiet of the house. The settee creaked once as James settled. The candles on the nightstand burned low. From somewhere outside the window, the autumn wind moved through the last of the oak leaves. A moment later she heard James at the washstand, and then the small, careful sounds of a man doing something quietly, so as not to wake her. She did not move. She kept her eyes on the ceiling. Then the light went out. In the morning, the housekeeper would change the bed linens. Eleanor would not ask how they had come to be marked in the way the linens of a wedding night were supposed to be marked. She understood, without being told, that James had managed it. She understood what it had cost, and she understood that he had done it without telling her, without making it a transaction between them, without asking for anything in return. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who would do that without ceremony. She thought about the ledger error she had seen on the desk. She thought about what he had said in the library, "The child will not be punished for the sins of its father." And she thought about what kind of man said a thing like that, and then closed his face again before you could see behind it. She did not have an answer. She had a marriage. She had the settled dark of a house that was now, in the legal and irrevocable sense, hers. The door of Wyndham Hall had closed behind her, and she was inside it, and whatever came next, she was not facing it alone. That was something. She was not yet sure it was enough, but it was something. The London house was larger than she had expected, and James showed her through it with the detached efficiency of a man reciting a steward's report. "Drawing room," he said, opening a door to a room full of silk curtains and gilded chairs. "Dining room, morning room. You may use any of these." "May I use the library?" Eleanor said. "It is the house's best room," he said. "I would not have brought you to London if I intended to bar you from the library." Eleanor went into the library and had to stop herself from making an undignified noise. It was 2 stories tall, with a wrought-iron gallery running around the upper level, and every surface was books, leather-backed, cloth-backed, paper-wrapped, stacked and standing and tucked at angles where they did not fit anywhere else. In the far corner, half hidden behind a row of geography volumes, was a section of shelf that swung out at a slight angle. She touched it. It swung. Behind it was a compartment roughly the size of a wardrobe, fitted with a small shelf that held a tin soldier with a bent sword arm, a child's school report in faded ink, a primer with the name James scrawled in large uncertain letters on the flyleaf, and a leather box. James appeared in the doorway. He looked at what she had found. A very specific look crossed his face, not anger, not embarrassment, but the look of a man who has just accidentally shown someone something he had not meant to show. "Your grandfather's design," Eleanor said. "Mine, actually," James said. "I was 11. I thought I was being remarkably clever." A pause. "I was being remarkably obvious, but no one ever checked." Eleanor looked at the leather box. She did not open it. She looked at it long enough for James to see that she had noticed it, and then she moved back to the main room. "A very good library," she said. And that was when Mrs. Holt arrived from Wyndham Hall. She had followed them to London without being asked, on the basis that someone needed to manage the situation, and she stood in the library doorway with her keyring at her waist, and the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years managing the Wyndham family's poor decisions, and was not about to stop now. "You," she said to James, "did not invite me to the wedding." James looked at her. "Mrs. Holt." "I bathed you," Mrs. Holt said with perfect dignity. "I dressed your first scrape. I told your mother, on multiple occasions, that you were not as ungovernable as she believed, and you were married in a church, without so much as a note sent to tell me. I was informed by Mr. Hollis." "I organised the ceremony in 2 days," James said. "Then you could have used one of those days to send a note." James looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man appealing to the only neutral party in the room. Eleanor looked back at him with entirely false innocence. "I believe," she said, "that Mrs. Holt is right." Mrs. Holt turned to Eleanor with an expression that shifted, in 1 second, from battle-ready to warmly satisfied. "You," she said, "have good sense." She glanced at James. "The Duchess has good sense. Take note." James drank his tea, 1½ sugar cubes, added with the precision of a man who had firm opinions about this and would not be argued out of them, and said nothing further. But he was, for just a moment, trying very hard not to smile. She noticed the portrait on the 3rd day. It hung on the landing of the main staircase, a large oil, the kind that spoke of expense and the assumption of permanence, depicting a man of about 40 in a dark coat with grey-green eyes and a settled expression. The name on the small plaque at the base read, "Edward Wyndham, Duke of Wyndham," and the date was 30 years old. James did not look at it. He passed it every morning and every evening and never once turned his eyes toward it, with the particular deliberateness of a man who has trained himself out of looking at something that used to hurt. Eleanor watched this for 4 days before she said anything. On the 5th morning, she stopped on the landing and looked up at the portrait fully. James came down the stairs behind her and stopped when he found her standing there. "Your father?" she said. "Yes," James said. "You look like him," she said. Something crossed his face. It was brief, and she would not have caught it if she had not been watching. Then it was gone. "I have been told so," he said. He went past her down the stairs without stopping. Eleanor stood on the landing and looked at the portrait of Edward Wyndham for another moment. She thought about a man who cannot look at his own father's face, and what that says about the wound underneath. She filed it in the column where it belonged. It would matter later. She was certain it would matter later. Back at Wyndham Hall, the estate accounts were kept in the study. Eleanor made the mistake of going in 3 weeks after their return because she needed to write a letter, and the writing desk was better there. The ledger was open on the side table. Her eyes moved to it before she had told them not to. She sat down with it. She told herself she was merely curious. 20 minutes later, she looked up and realized she had been working for 20 minutes, and that the discrepancy she had noticed the first night, the figure that balanced but traced back wrong, was not an isolated error. It appeared 7 times across 4 quarterly settlements, each time assigned to a category that could absorb the charge without raising immediate alarm, each time in a slightly different hand from the surrounding entries. This was not an error. She went to find James. He was in the library, reading or trying to read. He had a book open and his attention somewhere else, a state Eleanor was beginning to recognize. He looked up when she came in. His expression shifted into the one he used when he was preparing to listen to an estate report. "The accounts," Eleanor said, and set the open ledger on his desk. "Eleanor," he began, with the faint tone of a man about to be patient. "Look at this column," she said. She put her finger on the figure, and this one, and traced them back to the quarterly settlement for the third quarter. She turned pages. "This charge is listed against the household account, but the delivery listed in the household account for that week does not exist. There was no delivery. The household register shows nothing. This charge belongs to a trade account, and when you trace it to the trade account, the credit is recorded there as well, with a different reference number." James looked at the page. He looked at the figure. He turned back to the previous page. He called for Mr. Hollis. Mr. Hollis arrived with the precise promptness of a man who considered any other response beneath him. James said, "Mrs. Wyndham has identified an inconsistency in the quarterly accounts. I would like you to review it with her." Mr. Hollis turned his attention to Eleanor. Eleanor showed him the figure. She showed him the trace. She showed him all 7 instances. Mr. Hollis studied the ledger for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Eleanor with an expression that had shifted significantly from his starting position. "These entries have been in the accounts for 16 months, he said. "They were not flagged in either quarterly review." "They would not be," Eleanor said, "unless you were looking for them specifically. The charge is placed in a category that appears correct at first glance. The discrepancy only shows when you trace back to the source records." Mr. Hollis said very carefully, "Mrs. Wyndham, are you suggesting these entries are intentional?" "I am suggesting," Eleanor said, "that they are not accidental." She glanced at James. His expression was no longer the expression he used for estate reports. It was something else, something careful and new, a look she had not seen on him before. He was looking at her the way she had caught him looking at the father's portrait on the staircase, with something behind it she could not quite name. He said nothing, but from that afternoon forward, when he went into the study and she was not there, he left the side door open. Eleanor wore her first new ball gown. It was deep green silk with cream-coloured trim. The dressmaker had spent 20 minutes on the green, moving swatches against Eleanor's hair and dark eyes with the authority of a professional, and Eleanor had stood on the step and allowed herself to be arranged, and for one small moment had felt something uncomplicated and entirely her own. The Wyndham Winter Assembly was the social marker of the county season, and as Duchess of Wyndham, Eleanor stood beside James at the door and received the county with a composure that only she knew was manufactured. The assembly rooms were bright and warm, the candles reflected in the tall windows, the music from the hired quartet filling the space with the cheerful noise of a room full of people determined to enjoy themselves. She felt Victor before she saw him. It was not a mystical thing. It was simple. She had spent 3 years learning to read his presence in a room, and her body had never unlearned it. She felt him across the room before her eyes found him. When her eyes found him, he was already looking at her. He was speaking to a man she did not recognize, one of Edmund's acquaintances, perhaps, and he smiled at her from across the room with the particular smile he used when he was absolutely certain he had the advantage. An envelope arrived, not delivered by a footman, delivered by her own brother, who was present at the assembly, and who looked confused and slightly apologetic, because the man who had given it to him had said only that it was a message from the estate office that needed Mrs. Wyndham's attention. Eleanor opened it. The note inside was in Victor's handwriting and said only, "You look very well, Eleanor. Save me a waltz." Fury flooded through her, clean and cold and clarifying. She folded the note. She put it in her evening bag. She crossed the room. Victor materialized at her elbow before she had taken 12 steps. "Eleanor," he said, "Mrs. Wyndham, congratulations are in order. The Duke, I never quite saw it." He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes in any meaningful way. He reached out and took her dance card from her wrist. He wrote his name on it. He handed it back. Eleanor took the card. She looked at it. She looked at Victor. The rage inside her was cold and focused and completely under control. She held the dance card up in both hands and she tore it in half. Cleanly, deliberately. She let both halves fall. "I have no card," she said, "and I am promised only to my husband." The nearest corner of the room had gone quiet. People had turned. The music continued, but 4 or 5 conversations had stopped, because something was happening here that was worth watching. Victor's smile did not collapse immediately. It held for exactly 2 seconds. Then it went cold, a different thing entirely from his usual warmth, something underneath the warmth that was calculating and patient and not, Eleanor understood, finished with her yet. James appeared at her side. He had been across the room. She did not know how he had crossed it so quickly. He was simply there, his presence at her back with the same quality the library had at night, solid and dark, and between her and whatever was coming from the other direction. "Hail," James said. He said it with no emotion at all, which was somehow more effective than anger would have been. Victor looked at James. Something passed between them, a measurement, a record. 2 men with no public quarrel, both knowing exactly what was between them. "Your Grace," Victor said. He was pleasant. He was impeccably pleasant. He retrieved his hat from the cloakroom and left the assembly 20 minutes later. Lavinia appeared at Eleanor's other shoulder. "That," she said, with deep satisfaction, "was magnificent. Can we discuss this over supper? I have been enduring Lord Pennock all evening, and I require a palate cleanser." She kissed him that night. She did not plan it. She was still in the ball gown, her hair half unpinned, the remains of the assembly still in her blood, the adrenaline of the torn card, Victor's cold smile, James appearing at her side. And James was across the room near the window, his coat removed, his cravat loosened, and he was watching her with an expression that was not the mask. She crossed to him. She reached up and she kissed him. He went completely still. She had expected somehow that he would step back, that the mask would come down, that the arrangement would reassert itself between them as a kind of protection. But he did not step back. He stood absolutely still and let her. He had the quality of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting for it. Eleanor kissed him for a moment that lasted long enough to matter. When she stepped back, the room was very quiet. James said, "The assembly was 3 years ago tonight, the last time I danced with someone other than myself." Eleanor looked at him. That was not what she had expected him to say. "That is a terrible way to describe dancing alone in a library," she said. "I was describing dancing at the last assembly," he said, "before Henry died, and I became something I was not intended to be. I was there, and you were not. You had gone to spend the season in Haverwick, I was told, and I thought, even then, that the room was less interesting for it." She stared at him. "I noticed you," he said, "before I should have, before anything had happened. That is all I am saying." He said it with no ornamentation. He said it the way he said everything true, flat and certain and completely without performance. Eleanor thought, standing in the lamplight in the green silk ball gown she had bought with his money, that she could love this man. She thought it clearly and directly, the way her father had taught her to record a figure that balanced. She was not surprised by the thought. She was only surprised that it had taken this long. "James," she said. He looked at her. "I think you should probably tell me about your brother," she said. "Not now, but soon." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Perhaps." He went to the settee and sat with his book. Eleanor changed behind the screen and went to bed. But she fell asleep thinking about a man in a library dancing alone, and all the years between then and now, and how close they had come to simply never intersecting at all. For the first time she realized she had something to lose. Mr. Hollis arrived with the envelope on a Tuesday. He carried it the way he carried everything consequential, level, both hands, with the formality of a man who understood the weight of what he was transporting. He set it on James's desk and said, "This has been held at the estate since your Grace was 6 years old. The conditions of its release were written in the old Duke's instructions to the household. It was to be given to James Wyndham upon the occasion of his marriage. As your Grace has now fulfilled that condition, it falls to me to deliver it." James looked at the envelope. He looked at Mr. Hollis. He said nothing. Mr. Hollis bowed and left the room. Eleanor was sitting across the desk with the estate ledger. She had been at it since breakfast, working through the quarterly accounts with the systematic patience her father had given her, and she was watching James's face as he picked up the envelope. She could see the handwriting on the outside from where she sat. She did not say anything. James opened it. He unfolded the letter first. He read it once. He set it down and read it again. His hands were still. His face was still. Eleanor had never seen this particular quality of stillness from him. Not the controlled stillness of the mask, but the stillness of a man who has been struck so completely that his body has not yet decided what to do next. She looked back at her ledger. In the column she was tracing, a familiar pattern had just revealed itself in full. Not 7 instances, as she had counted before. 14. 14 separate transactions across 3 years, each one redirected through a trade account that had nothing to do with the delivery it was charged against. The amounts were not enormous individually. Together they represented a systematic and deliberate siphoning of Wyndham estate income over 3 years. Eleanor had worked backwards through the accounts for 6 weeks. She now knew whose name appeared across every fraudulent entry. The trade accounts ran through a merchant company that listed as its principal agent 1V Hale. Victor Hale had been stealing from James's family while he was stealing 3 years of Eleanor's life. She set down her pen. James was still looking at the letter. She waited. The study was completely quiet. Outside, the winter birds moved in the bare oak trees. The fire crackled once. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the silence with polite precision. James put the letter down. He turned it over and looked at the seal, which was his father's seal, 3 years old. He turned it back. His jaw moved once, and then was still. On the separate sheet inside the envelope, the promissory note was written in a hand Eleanor could read from across the desk. The figure of £20,000, payable to James Wyndham, Duke of Wyndham, for the purpose of the establishment of any enterprise the said James Wyndham considers worthy of his attention and character. Beneath it, his father's handwriting again, in the personal note that accompanied the formal document. This is for when you find the greatness I have always known is within you. I am sorry I will not be there to see it. Your father, who loved you. James looked up from the letter. He found Eleanor looking at him. She had not meant to be caught looking. She looked away. Neither of them spoke. "It is Victor Hale," Eleanor said. She said it without preamble. She turned the ledger so James could see it, and she pointed to the column, to the trade account, to the merchant company name. She pointed to each of the 14 entries one by one. She did not rush. James looked at what she was showing him. His expression moved through 3 things she could see. Recognition, then confirmation, then something much colder. Not the cold of the mask. The cold of anger that has found its reason. He has been taking from the estate for 3 years, Eleanor said, through this merchant account. The amounts are... She told him the total. She had calculated it precisely. James was quiet. He was doing this, Eleanor said carefully, at the same time as he was doing what he did to me. I do not know if these things are connected deliberately, but they were happening simultaneously. James looked at the ledger. He looked at his father's letter. He looked at Eleanor. "I want to destroy him," he said. He said it quietly and without drama and with absolute sincerity. "I know," Eleanor said, "but not yet. Not until we can do it properly, in front of people who matter." She held his gaze. "I have an idea," she said. Sophia arrived without warning 2 days later, the way Sophia did everything that mattered, directly and immediately, and without consulting anyone's schedule. She sat across from Eleanor at the dining room table, put her hands flat on the surface, and said, "Agnes changed your sheets on your wedding night. I know what clean sheets mean, and I know what they meant that night, and I know what you have looked like for the past 6 months. Tell me." Eleanor looked at her sister for a long moment. "I am pregnant," she said, "and the child is not James's." The silence lasted 4 seconds. Sophia said, "How far along are you?" 7 months, Eleanor said. Sophia said, "Is the father going to be a problem?" "He has been a problem since the beginning," Eleanor said. Sophia said, "Right, so what do we need to do next?" Gratitude flooded through Eleanor, warm and total and almost painful, because she had been carrying this alone for so long that Sophia's complete lack of condemnation felt like putting down something very heavy. She had not realized how heavy it was until someone else had seen it and not flinched. "We need evidence," Eleanor said, "and we need a room full of the right people." "Tell me everything," Sophia said. Eleanor told her everything. It was James who told her about Wyndham Press. He said it without ceremony, sitting across from her in the library after Sophia had gone, the fire between them, the accounts closed for the day, and he said it the way he said everything that was purely his own, flat, certain, slightly defensive, as if he expected her to find it absurd. "There are no quality publishing houses in the county," he said. "There should be. There is enough writing in this county and enough printing capacity in the village to sustain a small house. I have been thinking about it since before Henry died. I never did anything about it because I was not the Duke, and it was not my decision to make, and then Henry was gone, and I became someone who makes decisions, but I had lost the capacity to care about any of them." He paused. "The money would be enough to begin it," he said. "My father's money. I think that is what he meant. I think he saw something in me that I stopped being able to see in myself 3 years ago, and I think he saved his money for this, so I would have no excuse not to try." Eleanor looked at him across the fire. "You should do it," she said. "I know," he said. "Tell me what you need," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she could now recognize, the one that was not the mask, the one he had not yet learned to suppress fast enough when she caught him wearing it. "I already have what I need," he said. "I have the accounts." He meant her. He said it carefully enough that she could choose to hear it as a reference to the ledger work. She chose, for the moment, to hear it that way. But she filed the other meaning in the column where it belonged. It started as an argument about names. Eleanor was lying on the bed with her back propped against the pillows, and James was sitting at the end of it, which was, in itself, a change. He had moved from the settee to the foot of the bed over the past few weeks, in increments small enough that neither of them had officially acknowledged the progression. He had a book. She had the running list of names she had been compiling since she had decided she would name the child herself, regardless of what anyone said. "Jacqueline," she said, "or Beatrice?" "Both are respectable," James said, without looking up. "Not both," Eleanor said. "One." "Unless you chose both," James said. "Jacqueline Beatrice." Eleanor considered this. "That is 2. Most people have 2. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was, she was almost certain, pretending to read. "What would you choose?" she said. "I would not presume to choose," he said. She looked at him. He put down the book. He moved to sit beside her. He reached out and placed his hand flat on her belly, and the baby moved, a long, rolling movement that she had grown accustomed to and that still sometimes made her catch her breath. And James's expression went through something she had not quite seen before. Not panic, as it had the first time, but something slower and more private. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like love. He lifted his hand. He traced something on the curve of her belly through the fabric of her dress. A sentence. 5 words, she thought. Perhaps 6. "What are you writing?" she said. "A name," he said. "Which one?" He moved his hand. He wrote it again, more slowly. She stared at the place on her belly where his finger had moved. "I cannot read your handwriting," she said. "It is terrible." "My handwriting is perfectly acceptable," he said. "It looks like it ends with a U," she said. He said nothing. "James?" "I will not tell you," he said. "You will have to wait." He picked his book back up. He was not reading it. Eleanor could see this clearly because his eyes had not moved across the page in the last 30 seconds, but she decided not to mention it. She lay back against the pillows and felt the warmth of the room around her, the fire, the candlelight, the quiet that had developed between them over months of the same house and the same meals and the same morning light. She thought about a man who writes on you the thing he cannot say with his voice. Whatever he had written, it had ended with you. That you was specific. She filed it in the column where it belonged. The thing he had written was, "I love you." She would not know this for another 2 months, but the words were already there, traced in the lamplight on her belly, waiting for her to catch up. Victor found her at the chapel gate. She had gone alone. James was inside by his father's memorial, which was where he went every year on this particular day, and she had left him there because that was the kind of grief you did not interrupt. The chapel grounds were quiet in the cold afternoon, the last light of Christmas Eve coming through the bare oaks at a low angle that turned everything gold and merciless. "Eleanor," Victor said. He had appeared from the path that led from the public road, which meant he had waited for her. She understood immediately that this had been planned. "You should not be here," she said. "I wanted to give you something," he said. "For the baby." He held out a box. His voice had the warmth she had spent 3 years learning to trust. "A token," Nothing more. She looked at the box. Inside, a silver rattle. Small, delicate, beautifully made. The handle was a flower stem, and the bells at the top were rosebuds, and there was a space at the base where a name was to be engraved, currently blank. "My child deserves something from its father," Victor said. She looked at him. Fury was inside her like a tide, cold, complete, entirely controlled. She did not touch the rattle. "You are not this child's father," she said. "You gave up that right in the clearing in October." "That is not how it works," he said pleasantly. "Eleanor, you have married a duke. That is very clever of you. But I am still the child's father, and there will come a time, perhaps not today, perhaps not soon, when that fact will matter very much. I would like us to be on good terms for that time." She put the box under her arm and left. She left because the alternative was not available to her. Not here, not alone. She could not put it back. She could not make it not have happened. She put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the house. She was going to tell James. She told herself she was going to tell James. She walked through the door with the box pressed against her ribs under her coat. James was there in the hallway, carrying the particular silence he carried every year on this day, the grief of it, compressed and still heavy. She looked at his face, and she could not do it. She put the rattle in the bottom of the wardrobe behind her winter boots. She would tell him tomorrow. She would tell him when the day was not this day. Victor sent her a note the next morning, delivered by a boy she did not recognize, 4 words in Victor's handwriting: "Until we meet again." She wrote back immediately to return the rattle. He sent it back. She looked at the thing for 4 days. On the 5th day she put it back in her coat pocket so she could take it to the post and send it to his solicitor, without Victor's name ever appearing on the covering note. On the 5th evening, James went into her coat looking for her gloves. She had left them in the pocket because her hands were cold and she was tired, and it was February, and he found the box. He opened it. He found the rattle. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the look of a man who has decided the question he least wanted to ask has already been answered. "When did you meet him?" James said. "James, when did you meet Victor Hale, Eleanor? While I was in the study? While I was in London last month? While I was—" "I have not met him," she said. "Let me explain." He had not been listening. She could see it, the moment his ears had closed, the same moment that expression had settled onto his face. He had already decided. He had always been the second son, the spare, the one who was not quite enough, and the assumption of inadequacy had moved faster than reason. He left for London that night. 2 months. Eleanor measured them by Sundays. 8 Sundays at the village church alone in the Wyndham family pew, which was large enough for 6 and which now held only Eleanor and Agnes, and the particular quality of the congregation's careful not noticing, which was worse than if they had stared. Victor appeared at the church on the 4th Sunday, at the collection box, by apparent coincidence, because Victor never did anything by accident. He said her name. Sophia appeared at Eleanor's other shoulder from nowhere, which was the quality Sophia had when she was angry, and said in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and absolutely unanswerable, "Lord Hale, I believe you are wanted on the other side of the churchyard." She did not wait for his response. She took Eleanor's arm and walked her out. "He comes every week," Sophia said outside. "Almost every week," Eleanor said. "Write to James," Sophia said. "I have written to James." "Write to him again." Eleanor wrote 3 letters. She wrote the first 2 out of hope. James burned them without reading them. She found out later from the London housekeeper's account. She was the Duchess, and the housekeeper wrote to the Duchess about the household. The letters had ended up in the fireplace, and she found out. The 3rd letter she wrote out of exhaustion and honesty. She wrote it at 2 in the morning on a Thursday when the baby was moving and the house was quiet and she had nothing left to perform. She wrote about the rattle and what Victor said and how she had hidden it and why and what he had sent afterward and the 4 words and the church. She wrote everything. She wrote it without making a case for herself, only the facts, in the order they happened, with the precision her father had given her, complete, legible, without embellishment. She sent it. James read it on a Wednesday morning in London. He read it once, and then he sat very still for a long time. Then he read it again. He He understood immediately that he had been wrong. He had behaved in a way that was ugly and jealous, and that was not what the evidence showed. He had let his fear do his thinking, and he had given Victor Hale exactly what Victor Hale wanted by leaving. He stayed in London for 2 more weeks anyway. He told himself this was about allowing Eleanor time to settle. It was not about that. It was about the specific terror of returning to someone who had every reason to be done with him, and finding out whether she was. He came back to Wyndham Hall on a morning in early April when the daffodils were up in the south garden. Eleanor was in the library. She had been there when he arrived. Agnes had let him in and said Mrs. Wyndham was in the library, and he had walked down the corridor and stood in the doorway and found her sitting at the desk with the estate accounts open in front of her, enormously pregnant, composed, waiting. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. He crossed the room and went down on one knee. Not both. One knee, which was worse somehow, the deliberateness of it, the specific physical accounting for what he had done. He looked up at her, and he said, "I was wrong. I left when you tried to speak. I was jealous, and I was afraid, and I made myself the judge without giving you the trial. I am sorry." Eleanor looked at him on the floor of her library. "I know," she said. "I know you are sorry. Stand up." He stood. He was thinner than he had been in February. She could see it in his face. He had not been taking care of himself, which was the thing James did when he was miserable that he would never name as misery. "James," she said, "I need you to take me somewhere." He looked at her. "The East Wing," she said. Something moved across his face, the smallest flinch quickly controlled. "Eleanor, please," she said. "I've been looking at that corridor for 8 months, and I have never once asked you what is there. I am asking now." He was quiet. She waited. She had learned, over 8 months of the same house, that James Wyndham's silences were working silences. He was never simply quiet. He was always deciding something. She could see what he was deciding now in the tension at his jaw and the stillness of his hands, whether to trust her with the thing he had kept locked since Henry died. He offered her his hand. She took it. The east wing of Wyndham Hall was at the end of the north corridor, behind a door that had been locked for 3 years. James took the key from his coat pocket. He always carried it. She had not known that until now, but she understood it immediately, and he unlocked the door and pushed it open. It was a suite of rooms, not one. The first room was a sitting room with covers over the furniture and the smell of disuse. Closed air, cold stone, the particular absence of warmth that settles when a space has gone unbreathed in for years. Beyond the sitting room was a bedroom. Beyond the bedroom was a small study that looked north toward the woods. In the study, on the desk, were Henry Wyndham's things exactly as he had left them. A letter half written to a correspondent they had never identified, his pen still in the holder, his inkwell closed. James stopped in the middle of the study. "He was better than me," he said. He said it not to Eleanor, but to the room. At everything, at the estate, at the title, at the particular quality of being exactly what a duke was supposed to be, the confidence of it, the surety. He never questioned whether he belonged here. He was the one who was supposed to inherit this. A pause. I was the spare. I was tolerated and reasonably well educated, and never quite the point. Eleanor said nothing. She stood in the doorway of the study and listened. "When Henry died," James said, "I inherited a position that was never meant to be mine. Within 2 weeks, Miss Lydia Hargrove, who had agreed to marry me when I was the second son, specifically because I was the second son and not the Duke, broke our engagement." His voice was even and quiet and exhausted. "She told me she had agreed to marry James Wyndham, not the Duke of Wyndham, because she could see the difference clearly, and I apparently could not. She married a baronet 6 months later." He turned from the desk. "I have kept this wing locked," he said, "because I cannot come in here and look at what Henry had, without feeling that I will never be adequate for what he left. His desk, his letter, his life, everything he knew what to do with that I have spent 3 years pretending to know what to do with." He looked at Eleanor. "That is what I have been carrying," he said. "That is why London. That is why the mask. That is why I left in February when I should have stayed. Because when the worst fear confirmed itself, when I thought I was being displaced again, I did what I have always done, which is leave before I can be formally told I was never enough." His voice did not break. He had compressed this for 3 years into something small and dense and controlled, and now it was out in the air for the first time. Eleanor crossed the room. She did not offer him comfort. She did not say he was enough. She did not say Henry would have been proud. She did not say any of the things that would have made it easier, and would have also been, in their way, another small lie. She crossed the room and she stood next to him, and she looked at Henry's desk with him, and she said, "I see you. Not the title, not the mask, not the man you think you are supposed to be. You." James looked at her. She met his eyes. "You are the first man," she said, "who ever gave me his handkerchief before he asked why I was crying. You are the man who managed the sheets without telling me how. You are the man who wrote something on my belly that ended with you and would not tell me what it was. You are the man who walked into this room tonight because I asked you to, even though it has been locked for 3 years." She paused. "That is who I see. That is who I have seen for 8 months." James was looking at her with an expression she had no name for. She had caught glimpses of it before, underneath the mask, underneath the anger, but never this fully. It was the look of a man who has just been given back something he thought he had lost for good. He said nothing. She did not need him to. They stood in the East Wing for a long time. Eventually Eleanor said, "I need to show you something." She had the dossier. She had been building it for months. Victor's letters, the ledger evidence, every piece of documented proof she had assembled. She set it on Henry's desk without ceremony, the way you set down a solution to a problem that has been too long without one. James looked at it. "The Tun dinner," Eleanor said. "The one you mentioned wanting to host before you left for London. We host it. We invite every family whose account appears in those ledger entries. We invite the families who have dealt with that trade account. We invite the magistrate, because if Victor is in a room full of people who can testify to these accounts, we will only need to do this once." James looked at her. "And Victor?" he said. "Victor," she said, "we do not invite. He will come anyway. He always does." James picked up the ledger pages she had assembled. He read through them with the focus of a man who has spent enough time on estates to understand accounts, and enough time on evidence to understand what he was looking at. "This is enough," he said. "It is more than enough," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. She held out her hand. He took it. She took his hand. That was all. But it was enough. The Wyndham Hall Tun dinner was the first formal entertainment the Duke had hosted since taking the title. 31 guests sat at the long table, county families, a magistrate from the neighbouring district, a solicitor, Edmund Wyndham, at his cousin's left hand, and at James's right hand, Eleanor Wyndham, Duchess of Wyndham, very nearly 9 months pregnant, and wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that Agnes had spent 4 evenings altering to accommodate her condition. The silver on the table was the full Wyndham silver, brought out for the first time since Henry's memorial service. The candles were new. The flowers were from the Wyndham Hall glass house, which had produced them a week early because Mrs. Holt had requested it in a tone that the gardener understood was not a request. Eleanor had the ledger pages in a flat case beneath the table. James had the solicitor's documentation of the trade accounts in his breast pocket. Victor Hale arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening and was shown in by a footman who did not know to refuse him. The instructions were to refuse only uninvited guests, and Victor had presented his card as if he had been invited, which he had not, and the footman had not been prepared to question it. Victor crossed the room. He said good evening to 3 people along the way. He found his seat at the far end of the table and sat in it with the ease of a man who understands that the most effective form of presence is simply to behave as though you belong. Eleanor saw him the moment he entered the room. James saw him a half-second later. His expression did not change. He continued the conversation he was having with the magistrate to his left. Your greatest advantage, when you were ready, was that your enemy could see you and not know it. Lavinia, seated 3 places down from Eleanor, glanced at Victor and then at Eleanor and then back at Victor, and said quietly to the woman beside her, "I wonder if anyone told him the fox hunt isn't until Thursday." The first course was served. The tension at the table was the tension of 31 people who did not know whether something was about to happen, and 2 people who did. Victor stood between the second and third courses. The room went quiet simply from the surprise of it. Standing during a formal dinner was not done. It pulled the eye immediately, and 30 pairs of eyes pulled to Victor, which was exactly what he wanted. "I apologize for the interruption," he said pleasantly, "but I find I cannot in good conscience remain silent any longer. There is a matter at this table that affects every person here, and I believe the Duke of Wyndham, whom I respect deeply, has been deceived." The silence was absolute. Eleanor watched James's face. She watched the muscles of his jaw settle one by one into controlled stillness. "The Duchess of Wyndham," Victor said, "came to his grace under circumstances that I believe he was not fully informed of. The child she carries is not his. I know this because I am the child's father. I have been trying to speak to Mrs. Wyndham, to her grace, for months, and I have been prevented from doing so. I ask only that the Duke be given the full truth before matters proceed further." He sat down. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. 28 people at the table were not moving. Dorothea's face was a mask with nothing behind it. Sophia's hands were flat on the table. Edmund had gone grey. Eleanor felt the fury that she had carried since the clearing in October, the cold, channeled, clarifying fury that had been waiting for precisely this moment. Moved through her like current. She looked at James. James was looking at Victor. His expression was the expression he had used at the Winter Assembly. Controlled, entirely without visible emotion, the specific composure of a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the correct moment. He looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes. She reached for the flat case under the table. Eleanor stood. She was 9 months pregnant, and she was wearing midnight blue, and the room was full of candles and witnesses, and she stood up, and she did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice when the facts were sufficient. "I would like to address several things," she said. "The first is this room." She opened the flat case. She set the estate ledger on the table. She turned it to the marked page, and turned it so the guest nearest could see the columns. "This is the Wyndham Hall estate ledger," she said. "I've been working through these accounts for 8 months, because the Duke was kind enough to trust me with the estate's financial management. In that time, I identified 14 transactions, spanning 3 years, in which charges were assigned to categories that did not match their source records. The amounts are not small. The pattern is deliberate." She named the amounts. She stated them clearly, in the precise order they appeared in the accounts. "The transactions traced to a merchant trading account registered under the name V. Hale," she said. "Across those 3 years, the estate was defrauded of a significant sum. Several families present at this table were also affected, their accounts running through the same trading company, their payments misappropriated through the same methods." She paused. 3 people at the table had gone very still with the particular stillness of recognition. "That is the first matter," Eleanor said. She reached into the case and drew out the second document. "Lord Hale stated that I concealed the parentage of my child from the Duke of Wyndham," she said. "He is correct in one respect. I did not name the father publicly. Lord Hale told me, the afternoon I informed him I was pregnant, that if I named him he would destroy my reputation before I could tell my story. He put this in writing." She unfolded the letter. She read it aloud. She read it without trembling. She read it without tears. She read every word of it, his calculation, his coldness, his casual certainty that her word was worth nothing against his. She read it in the clear, even voice of her father's daughter. Figures do not lie. Documents do not lie. Words put in writing are permanent, and they can be read aloud in rooms exactly like this one, at exactly the right moment. The room was completely silent when she finished. Victor had gone pale. His hands, which had been resting lightly on the table, had stilled. The woman seated nearest him pushed her chair back from the table by 3 inches. "That," Eleanor said, "is the second matter." She set the letter down. She sat. The room erupted, not in shouting, in the particular sound of a room full of people turning toward each other, the collective intake and release of 31 people who have just witnessed something they will describe to their children. 3 guests stood simultaneously. The magistrate, who had been sitting very still for the past 4 minutes, reached for his wine-glass and set it down again without drinking from it, because he was thinking about something else. Lavinia said, from 3 seats down, very quietly, but entirely clearly, "Magnificently done." Mr. Hollis came forward. He moved through the noise of the room with the particular authority of a man who has been managing the Wyndham household for 30 years and has never once done so hastily. He set down the solicitor's documents. James's solicitor had spent 6 weeks correlating the trading records with the estate accounts. The resulting analysis made the fraud clear in terms that required no interpretation. Mr. Hollis set it on the table beside Eleanor's ledger. "These documents were prepared by the Wyndham estate solicitor," he said, "to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. They have been available for review since yesterday morning." Lord Pemberton, whose family timber business had been trading through the same merchant account, stood. "I have seen this pattern in my own records," he said. He addressed the magistrate directly. He did not look at Victor. "I would like to report this formally, as would, I believe, several others at this table." 2 other guests said yes, without hesitation. Victor's letter was passed down the table. Each person who received it held it for a moment and passed it to the next. The room was still making noise, but the noise had changed its character. It was no longer the noise of shock. It was the noise of people deciding what they were going to do next. Victor was still seated. He was still entirely composed. He had not said anything since Eleanor had begun reading, and he would not say anything further. He had calculated all the exits and found that they were closed. All that was left to him was the appearance of dignity. Eleanor recognized it. It was exactly the composure she had worn in the library in October. She had nothing to say to it, and nothing left to do except the same thing she had done then. She kept moving. James stood. He came around the table. He walked past 3 guests without stopping, and he came to Eleanor's side, and he held out his arm. She took it. She rose, slowly, because 9 months pregnant does not permit a dramatic spring to one's feet, and James's arm was there to help, which he offered without comment. He turned to face the room. "This woman," he said, "is Eleanor Wyndham, Duchess of Wyndham, the finest accountant in the county, and the only person who has made this estate worth managing in 3 years." He said it the way he said everything that was absolutely true, flat, certain, completely without performance. "She is my wife and my equal and the mother of my heir." He looked at Eleanor. "Jacqueline Beatrice Wyndham," he said. "That is my daughter's name. I know what I wrote, and I know what I said, and I know both are the same thing." He said this to Eleanor and not to the room, but the room heard it. The room would spend the next month trying to understand what he meant, and would not quite manage it, and that was entirely as it should be. He looked back at the room. "I love this woman," he said. "I should have said it months ago, and I chose instead to write it in a hand she could not read on a surface she could not keep. I am rectifying that now, in front of everyone who matters to me, which happens to be the same people who have been defrauding my family and threatening my wife while I was in London, being oblivious." A sound moved through the room, not quite laughter, but something close to it. The tension had found an unexpected way out. James said to the magistrate, "I would welcome your involvement at your earliest convenience." The magistrate said he would call in the morning. "Mr. Hollis," James said. Mr. Hollis appeared at Victor's shoulder with the promptness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this instruction. "Lord Hale's coat," James said, "and a footman to see him to the gate." Victor stood. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at Eleanor with the expression he had worn in the clearing in October, the expression of a man who still believes, somewhere beneath the evidence, that this is not finished. He said, "Until—" "No," Eleanor said. Just the one word. She said it without heat, without drama, without anything at all except the same flat certainty with which she had read the letter. Victor left. 3 conversations broke out simultaneously at the dinner table. The solicitor opened his documents. Lord Pemberton was speaking to the magistrate. Sophia had reached across the table and taken Eleanor's free hand in both of hers. She was gripping it in a way that said everything she had not had the chance to say for the past 2 months without a single word. Then Dorothea Wyndham rose from her chair. The room went quiet again. Dorothea had a particular quality when she chose to use it, a gravity that silenced people not because they feared her, but because they sensed, instinctively, that something consequential was about to be said. She looked at her son. "James," she said, "I have underestimated you since you were born. I measured you against your brother, and I measured you against the title, and I measured you against expectations I had made up for another man's life." She paused. "This evening has shown me exactly what your father told me 30 years ago when you were 6 years old, and he said you would exceed every expectation I had ever had for Henry. He was right. Another pause. "I am sorry it has taken me this long to admit it. I intend to make up the time." The silence after she sat down lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. Then the room erupted with the specific noise of 31 people deciding this was the most memorable dinner they had attended in years. Eleanor did not hear any of it. She was looking at James, he was looking at her, and then he said, very quietly, with one arm still under her elbow and his grey-green eyes at exactly the level of her own, "I believe we may need to relocate to the Rose Suite quite soon." Eleanor looked at him. She felt it then, the shift of pressure that had been building since halfway through Victor's speech. Unmistakable, absolute. "Yes," she said, rather urgently as it turns out. She was in labour. The doctor arrived at 10:30. He said very carefully that the presentation was unusual. He said this while looking at James rather than Eleanor, which Eleanor found irritating enough to comment on, and the doctor began addressing her directly, which improved the situation somewhat. "Footling breech," he said, "feet first." He said it with the particular calm of a man delivering bad news that he needed the room to receive without panic. James did not leave. Eleanor expected him to. The convention was that husbands waited outside, and James was nothing if not a man who understood convention. But when the doctor said feet first and the midwife came in and the hour moved past midnight, James was still there. He was in the chair by the window, his formal evening coat removed, his cravat undone, his face composed and very pale. Eleanor reached for his hand, and he gave it without being asked. It was a very long night. There was a moment, not the worst moment, but close to it, when the doctor said something in a low voice to the midwife, and what he said did not need to be repeated, because Eleanor understood the problem from the way they moved. The cord was there. Her daughter was blue and still, and for 4 seconds nothing happened, and the silence was the most terrible silence Eleanor had ever heard. Then the midwife did what midwives know how to do, and the baby made a sound. It was a small sound, outraged and congested, and entirely alive. The sound of it went through Eleanor like a tide, relief so complete and sudden that it was indistinguishable from joy, warm and total and enormous, flooding every part of her that had been braced against the worst. James let go a breath he had been holding, she thought, since well before midnight. The doctor said everything was well. He said it several times because the room needed to hear it several times. He gave the baby to the midwife, and the midwife cleaned her and wrapped her, and gave her to Eleanor. And Eleanor held her daughter for the first time, and looked at her face. Jacqueline Beatrice Wyndham had a wisp of white blonde hair, and her father's precise, unreadable expression. She did not look like James. She did not look like Eleanor. She looked entirely like herself, which was the most specific thing about her. James reached over and offered the baby his finger. Jacqueline gripped it. She gripped it with the absolute conviction of someone who has just arrived in a world full of things worth holding on to, and has decided this one is a good place to start. James looked at Jacqueline, gripping his finger. He looked up at Eleanor. "Tell me what you want her name to be," he said. Eleanor looked at him, at this man who had offered her his handkerchief in a library, put her name on a deed of trust, gone down on one knee in April, and stood up in a room full of 30 people and said the words aloud at last. "Jacqueline," she said, "because you have always called yourself Jack when no one important was listening." James was quiet. "She is important," Eleanor said. "She is the most important, and now you have a witness." He could not speak. She could see that clearly. He had been precise and correct and controlled for the entire length of their acquaintance. Running out of words was the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. It was enough. The baby slept. The candles burned low. James was still in his chair with the formal evening coat over his arm and his cravat loose, and Jacqueline's grip on his finger, which she had not relinquished. Outside, the Tun dinner was dispersing at a civilized hour, and the magistrate had called for his carriage, and 30 guests were carrying home the story of the Duchess of Wyndham and the estate ledger. Inside the Rose Suite, no one cared. Dorothea came to the nursery the following evening. James was there alone with Jacqueline. Eleanor was sleeping finally, which she had needed to do since approximately the first course of the Tun dinner. He looked up when his mother came in and said nothing. Dorothea stood at the edge of the nursery and looked at Jacqueline in his arms. The baby's white blonde hair was visible against the swaddling. She did not look like anyone in the Wyndham family. "May I hold her?" Dorothea said. James gave her the baby. Dorothea held Jacqueline with the ease of a woman who had held infants before. Her whole posture shifted, softened. A different version of her had taken over from the one she showed the world. She looked at Jacqueline's face. "She has good hands," she said. "Eleanor has good hands. The baby has them." James said nothing. Dorothea looked at her son over the top of the baby's head. "I love you, James," she said. "I have always loved you in the way that I know how to love, which is not well enough. I am aware of that." She paused. "I measured you against Henry your entire life. I measured you against everything I thought you were supposed to be. I never measured you against what you actually are, which is considerably more than I deserved." She looked back at Jacqueline. "I am sorry for the wasted time." James said, "I know." "I would like to make up the time," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know that too," he said. Dorothea held Jacqueline for another 10 minutes without speaking. The nursery was warm and the lamp was low and the house was settling into its evening quiet. When Dorothea gave the baby back, she pressed her hand briefly against James's cheek, the first time she had done that since he was 6 years old, and then she went out. James sat in the nursery chair with his daughter, and was, for the first time in 3 years, not carrying anything heavier than the weight of a sleeping child. 3 years later, the library. The autumn light came through the tall windows at the angle it always came in October, gold and level, turning the spines of the books amber. On the library desk, the estate accounts were open, and Eleanor Wyndham was working through them with the same systematic patience she had brought to every quarterly settlement for the past 3 years. She was the Duchess of Wyndham, the accounting partner of Wyndham Press, and the woman who had once found 14 fraudulent entries in a column that nobody else had thought to check. Wyndham Press had printed its 5th novel that spring. It was a 3-volume romance set in the Pennine Hills, and the subscription list had been the largest they had managed yet. James had come into the library the morning the subscriber letters arrived and stood in the doorway, with an expression she knew, the look of a man who had finally found the greatness his father's letter had been keeping for him. She had looked up from the accounts and said, without ceremony, "Well done." He had said, "We." She had said, "Yes, we." They had gone back to their respective work. That was the language of a partnership with nothing left to prove. Jacqueline Beatrice Wyndham, Jackie, at home. Jacqueline Beatrice, on formal occasions. Your Grace's daughter, among the household staff who had immediately adopted her as a collective project, was 2 years old and had her father's dark hair and her father's grey-green eyes and a second child's firm conviction that the entire library had been installed for her personal exploration. She had been walking for 4 months, and in those 4 months had developed specific opinions about book spines as gripping surfaces. Eleanor was aware of her daughter's progress across the library floor in the peripheral way that mothers develop, the particular attention that does not need to be direct to be total. She heard Jackie pull herself upright on the shelf that held the quarterly reports, and then the small determined sounds of a child who has identified a specific book at a height that is technically reachable if one's determination is sufficient. She heard James come into the library. She did not look up. He would have seen, from the doorway, everything she was hearing, his daughter at the shelf, his wife at the desk, the accounts open and the pen moving. She knew he stood in the doorway for a moment before he moved. She knew him that well. She knew him as well as she knew the quarterly figures, which was completely enough. He crossed the room. He crouched down next to Jackie and held the book steady while she pulled it from the shelf. A small volume of natural history, which was not the book he would have chosen for her, but she had chosen it herself, and that was the point. "The one with birds in it," he said, turning to the pages she had apparently already identified from the spine. Jackie said something affirmative and pointed at a heron. Victor Hale had married an heiress in the summer after the Tun dinner. The heiress had discovered his debts within 6 months of the wedding. Eleanor had read this in a letter from Sophia and had filed it in the column where it belonged, which was the column marked closed. Lavinia had gotten herself into something complicated involving a young artist from Bath, and a letter that had been intercepted by her mother. The subsequent series of events Lavinia described in her most recent letter as catastrophic. Eleanor suspected it was probably the best thing that had ever happened to her. The letter had ended with a postscript that said simply, "More to follow." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at her daughter and her husband, at the heron in the book, at the autumn light on the library floor. Her second child moved inside her with the particular rolling ease of a child who has plenty of room and is in no hurry. She was inside Wyndham Hall. She had been, for 3 years, standing still. Once, Eleanor Ashby had walked through autumn alone, carrying a secret she could not put down, toward a lit house that was not yet hers. Now she was inside it. The light was warm, the accounts were balanced, her daughter was reaching for a book, and she was home.